Well, going back to our story on the Canadian statement, which clarified their position, and they also rejected the idea of those media reports that were going out in Canada. They've also said that there is no proof of any Indian government hand. We are joined by Professor Harshvardhan Pant, the Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation, to throw light on this. Professor Pant, thanks for being with us. Now, has Canada finally understood, they have a one India policy, they've understood what it really means in a sense? So I can't hear you.
Sorry. Yes. I think you can now.
Yes, go ahead.
I think they have understood, and perhaps it's a late recognition that this kind of selective leakage of information, this kind of selective media briefing, and incomplete and inaccurate media briefings at times can do a lot more damage to Canada's global image and Canada's ties with India, perhaps, than they realized when this whole episode started. So finally, now that there is a semblance of sensibility in the way they have communicated the latest aspect, does tell you that they are learning their lessons. But I think the damage has already been done, and in some ways, what Canada does from now onwards, and if perhaps it can now dial down the rhetoric and go back to the basics when it comes to diplomatic niceties, would perhaps determine India-Canada trajectory. But I think this step is certainly a welcome step of acknowledgement that what has been happening for a while now has done enormous damage to India-Canada ties and the way Canada is perceived in India.
Well, but Professor Pant, what can be expected from now on? Will separatist elements, continue to get sanctuary in Canada? What can we expect?
Well, I don't think that is going to change much, because unfortunately, Mr. Trudeau's government is a captive of very parochial interests, and those interests have not allowed him to have a very sensible policy towards India and towards the larger issue of extremism and separatism and terrorism, which can bite Canada much more harshly than they realize. So I think in the ultimate analysis, what we are witnessing now is perhaps the end of Mr. Trudeau's political term in Canada, the way, for example, opinion polls have projected that if elections were held today, he would lose massively. And therefore, perhaps a recognition that his political cards that he had been playing are only backfiring, not only damaging Canada's global credibility, but also not giving him any political fillip at home that he so desired when he started off this entire charade of his India policy.
And what are the potential implications of the standoff, on bilateral trade and investment between India and Canada? After all, I mean, there's such a large Indian community there, and there is a presumption that, over time, the trade and business investment would actually increase because of this diaspora connect.
Absolutely. I think the two nations have so much going for them. The relationship has so much going for it, particularly with regard to the societal connections that the two nations have, and also with regard to, in some ways, the economic ties that the two nations have been able to build. I think Prime Minister Modi's landmark visit to Canada, I think it was 2015, when he and then Prime Minister Stephen Harper had laid down the basics of this engagement, very expansive roadmap. That all came to naught with Mr. Trudeau coming to office thereafter, and his very partisan approach to foreign policy. And that meant that all that optimism, all that potential that had been there in the relationship could not really be realized. And I think now, as you look back and you look at the extent of diasporic engagement, you look at extent of trade engagement, much could have been accomplished in these last few years that was made subservient to the broader political agenda of the Trudeau government. Is hopefully once we see a bit of sanity on the Canadian side, we might also see movement on these fronts.
But do you see any legal or diplomatic challenges in resolving the extent of the standoff? After all, I mean, relations have deteriorated. We know we've seen now some sort of turnaround, but at least in the near term, do you find that there are going to be some challenges?
I think the challenges are huge, because the distrust is the levels of distrust are quite high, and I think perhaps Mr. Trudeau has become symptomatic of this larger problem in Canadian foreign policy of how do you engage India when you have, almost backstabbed India in dealing with some of the most critical issues. India, after all, was from the very beginning pointing out that look, some of these elements that you are sheltering, some of these sentiments that you are promoting, they will do great damage to India-Canada cause, of course, but they will also do damage to Canada's reputation. And that's exactly what has happened. I think much contrary to what perhaps Mr. Trudeau and his administration they were expecting. It is Canada that has been put in the dock. In some ways, the questions that even some of Canada's closest allies have asked, are directed at Canada. So in that sense, I think how do you bridge that divide that has, the chasm that has increased under Mr. Trudeau? That remains the biggest challenge. And therefore, I think in some ways, dialing down of Canadian rhetoric and some of the, statements that they have made do create favorable optics and favorable reality for this relationship to move forward. But I think Mr. Trudeau it has become symptomatic of the problem. And unfortunately, so long as he's in office, this challenge will always remain that can you really trust his administration? Can you really move beyond the kind of bad atmospherics that he has created for this relationship? And can you really go to the fundamentals of the problem that exists, that perhaps both Canada and India would want to weed out, but unfortunately for domestic political reasons, Trudeau decided to use it against India. So I think those challenges continue to pervade the Canadian diplomatic relationship.
Also, Professor Pant, to what extent, has Hindu-Sikh unity helped in preventing a more serious communal divide in Canada and, a possibly serious disruption in the relations?
I think that has been quite exemplary. If you see how the two communities have actually worked together rather than being at loggerheads. There have been some stray incidents here and there, but by and large, if you see the kind of the significant diaspora that we have in Canada and the communities that have held together, this idea that India stands united behind this idea of against this idea of separatism, against this idea of extremism, and I think that Hindu-Sikh unity has perhaps been one of the most fascinating aspects of this debate, because in some ways it would have been very easy to provoke a divide, and everything that Trudeau administration did would have been, in some ways added to the complexity of the problem and to intra-communal tensions. But I think the way the community leaders managed it, and the way, in some ways, the top leadership of both communities took a stand against some of the most challenging issues that confront not only India but Canada also. I think that has created I think the sense of optimism that you were talking about. That ultimately, if the community continues to hold together, then the challenge of diplomatic problem being resolved with some semblance of sanity always remains. And I think that's what has kept the relationship going rather than any political attempt by Trudeau administration.
And also, if we look at recent events, the G20 recently took place. Do you think that anything would have happened over there that might have changed changed the mind of Prime Minister Trudeau, the way he was behaving and the way he was portraying this situation, this problem, the sanctuary given to separatists? I mean, we are maybe reading too far into the statement, but at least it's one change that is a change for the better.
I think it is a change for the better. I think, given how bad the ties have been, these are small green shoots of recovery, perhaps, that we can, take solace from. And I do think that, when you look at the global map today and where India stands and how global leaders are vying to have a relationship with Prime Minister Modi and India, I think that tells you the story that in some ways, Mr. Trudeau would have felt very isolated at these multilateral platforms, and would have also then therefore taken a step that, look, it is perhaps in Canada's best interest to have a relationship with India that is forward-looking, that in some ways dials down the rhetoric, that in some ways manages to bring back the relationship to some semblance of normalcy. It is going to be very difficult, as we have been discussing, but I think if you look at it from a global perspective, Perhaps for Mr. Trudeau, the writing is on the wall that even as he loses domestic political support and he feels globally isolated, Prime Minister Modi has only become stronger, coming to office for the third time, and also becoming being very popular with all kinds of global leaders. So I think that sentiment also would have led to certain changes in the tonality of Canadian diplomatic engagement with India. But we'll have to wait and watch and see how this progresses, because I think there is also a likelihood that as Mr. Trudeau faces political debacle in the coming months, he might once again be tempted to use the rhetoric that he has used in the past.
Right. Thanks very much, Professor Harshvardhan Pant, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation, for joining us for the moment. Thanks for being with us.